And welcome everyone to the USBLN Balancing Work and Cancer, How Employers Can Work webinar. At this time, I want to introduce your host for today's session, Ann Outlaw, who will do some introduction on our presenter for today. Ann, you have the microphone.
Okay, well thank you very much, Claudia, and to the ADA Great Lakes Center for hosting today's webinar as well. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar, which is Balancing Work and Cancer, How Employers Can Help. Just a reminder that today's materials are all copyrighted, so if you wish to use any of the information presented, you must contact our presenters for permission. We have dedicated time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, and at that time you'll be requested to type your questions into the chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Rebecca Nellis. She is the Chief Mission Officer for Cancer and Careers, and since 2004, Rebecca has helped evolve the organization from early concept to national prominence. She now oversees all mission-driven initiatives, including the long-term strategy and growth of Cancer and Careers, many programs and services. As an expert on cancer workplace issues, she travels the country speaking at national cancer conferences and community events. Rebecca holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from New York University and a Master of Public Policy from Georgetown University. Her graduate thesis was entitled Implications of Cancer Survivalship on Financial Assets, Work Productivity, and Employment Circumstances. So thank you very much for joining us, Rebecca. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, thank you, Ann, and thank you, Claudia, for all your help and support to get this on the ground. I'm so excited to be giving some of this information today. Just a little bit of a note. Claudia, hopefully we're on the Cancer and Career slide at this point. Just a little bit about who we are. For nearly 15 years, Cancer and Careers has been at the forefront of this issue, helping patients, survivors, caregivers, and employers navigate the intersection of work and cancer. We serve people with any type of cancer in any kind of job, from the manufacturing line to the C-suite. All of our programs and services are provided to patients, survivors, and healthcare professionals free of charge. We've trained staff at major cancer institutions, including Johns Hopkins, Northwestern, UCLA, and the Mayo Clinic. Change slide, please. It always helps to put the problem into some context. So on the next couple of slides, and sort of sprinkled throughout the presentation, I'm going to share a little bit of data that will help us frame this issue. I, of course, won't read it all to you, but want to make sure to call some attention to some specific points that I think are really valuable as takeaways. So on this slide in particular, I think it's important to note that as of January 2014, so we know this number is higher now, there were more than 14.5 million cancer survivors in the US. So we're talking about a big population of people. Next slide, please. And specifically when it comes to work in cancer, there's some relevant data, although not enough as far as I'm concerned. But two key stats to focus on here are that in 2014, 44% of people who were newly diagnosed were of working age. And I hope you'll note that on the slide, working age is in quotes, because we don't really know what that means anymore in terms of the outer end of what it means to be a worker in this country now. So I believe this number is fairly conservative in the sense that many people are working well beyond what we used to consider traditional retirement age, or doing new things, or having a second career, or finding another way to contribute following the end of their formal work life. And so I think it's important to take that into account when we think about how many people are being affected by this issue. And then the other bullet point on this slide that I want to call your attention to is that there's data that shows that 20% of cancer survivors are still reporting work limitations affected by their cancer-related problems 1 to 5 years after diagnosis. And this is important because I think early on, when I first started working at Cancer and Careers, which was many years ago now, we thought our sweet spot was the moment of diagnosis and maybe through that first year, when people are really in the throes of trying to figure out what to do. And that certainly is a critical moment of complexity and distress for someone, but it's not the only one in a cancer experience. So it's very possible that though you may not have someone on your staff right now who's going through active treatment, you may have someone or more than one person on your staff who is still experiencing the aftermath of a cancer diagnosis and treatment. And as we get more and more science and we learn more and more about the effects of treatment, we're going to see more and more how long those realities go on for someone. And so I think it's important to sort of think about this in the context of not just someone who is immediately experiencing it, but also the possibility that someone is experiencing these challenges after the fact. Next slide, please. So we're going to spend the first part of this presentation thinking about what the employee's issues are. And it's of course different for each person depending upon diagnosis, treatment protocol, their reaction to the treatment. So it's really our role at Cancer and Careers to help survivors know the right questions to ask themselves and others, to help them be informed so they can make the best decisions for them, even though oftentimes there are going to be competing needs that they have to address. But it's really all about helping the individual regain some sense of control. So we'll start by focusing on people who are newly diagnosed. And key issues for them include the decision about whether to work or take time off, and things they're going to be considering are what are their job demands, does their work include travel? What are the physical demands of their job? Do they lift heavy boxes or need to be able to walk a certain amount? Do they work long hours? Is their commute long? Cancer and Careers happens to be based in New York, so I always like to point to thinking about people who spend a lot of time on public transportation. Is someone going to realistically be able to do an hour commute each way while they're going through treatment? And that could be true from a driving perspective. You know, everything changes once treatment begins. And of course, a person needs to think about their financial and insurance needs, and often that can be a real driver for why someone wants to work or needs to work. But it's not the only reason. Identity comes into play in this conversation. How does someone see their work in terms of who they are and what they contribute to the world? Because that can be very important. There are also a number of federal laws that relate to cancer patients' rights, discrimination, and benefits, and I'm sure you all know that these laws are for the protection of both the employer and the employee. And I won't go into the details of each too much, but it is important to touch on them as we talk about this today. The agencies that oversee each program provide online compliance guides that are helpful for both the employee and the employer in terms of looking for a place to find guidance. And of course, familiarizing yourself with federal and state laws can be very valuable. But the first law we're going to specifically touch on briefly is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which is a federal law that may protect someone who is diagnosed with cancer from discrimination and may provide access to reasonable accommodation. And it's really the federal law that creates a path for people to work through treatment and recovery. And at Cancer and Careers, we like to talk about it as a tool, because I think often people are a little bit wary or afraid of the law, as it sounds like maybe it's going to become negative in some way. And really it's just a pathway to finding common ground between an employer and an employee in terms of what's going to work for everyone and what does a person want to be able to do. There are of course limitations to the law, like with all laws. In this case, one of the key ones is that it only applies to companies with 15 or more employees. So it's important for both employers and employees to understand that they're also bound by state laws, and some state laws cover even smaller employers. And then in a whole other area, another key issue that newly diagnosed patients are thinking about is disclosure. Who are they going to tell this news to, and when and how are very big questions that they're going to address. And then in the world of social media and online brands and people having life not just in person but virtually, it's become even more complex. And so we hear more and more about people accidentally disclosing to their workplace because they shared something online. And it can have a lasting impact on a person professionally if they change jobs in the future or they change supervisors in the future. So it's just an important piece of the puzzle for anyone who's going through this to think about what their activities online are and how they're in alignment with their disclosure decisions. Next slide, please. So in the first part of the webinar, we've gone ahead and included some quotes from actual employees who faced the challenges of balancing work and a diagnosis, so you could get a sense firsthand of what they experienced. This first quote comes from a survivor who was diagnosed in 2002, and it discusses the immediate fear someone experiences after a diagnosis. And he said, "The biggest thing a cancer patient has initially is fear. It's fear of the unknown, fear of the consequences. If a manager can encourage his employee by saying, 'Hey, we're here alongside you, we're here to help.' I've read instances where companies have found out that a person has cancer and has fired them. That was not my case, but I've read that at least once. So a cancer patient who's facing the unknown is concerned about, 1, his health, and 2, his financial wherewithal to withstand the cancer treatments." Next slide, please. And back to that identity of how does work play into back to the idea of identity and how does work play into that. You know, when we first meet someone, we don't ask what's your favorite vacation location. We ask what do you do, and we learn something about them. So when that's called into question, it can be very stressful. So this quote from a woman who was diagnosed actually more than 10 years ago with lymphoma, had treatment for nearly a year and found work to be a place of positivity and important to her identity. And what she said was, "It gave me something to focus on rather than focusing on feeling sick. It gave me a sense of purpose and identity beyond someone who had cancer and somebody who was being labeled as sick. I lost all of my hair, so it was very visible that I was going through these treatments. Having something that really provided that sense of value and appreciation that I was really helping people was so important as I went through all of my treatment." Next slide, please. So as we move along, we sort of talked briefly about the issue someone who's newly diagnosed faces, and it's just to give you a sense of where that person is coming from. And now we'll spend a little bit of time giving that same sense for someone who has decided to work through active treatment. And so those key issues start with the decision about whether to tell at work or not. There's certainly a legal element to that. An employee isn't required to disclose any information about their health. However, an employee who doesn't disclose anything at work may not have access to the same benefits and protections under something like the ADA, because if nothing is disclosed, it's hard to discriminate against someone. So it becomes a tension in terms of deciding what the person needs most and when they need it. But it also comes down to company culture. You know, does the person work in a very collegial, small team environment or in a very sort of sterile, independent work environment? Does the big corporation they work for actually operate more like a small family? These are all questions that the person is going to need to ask themselves in order to think through what they might want to do when it comes to disclosure. And their personal style is a very important piece of the puzzle. Not everyone is a sharer, where some people couldn't imagine going through this without telling at work. And then after that, it's important for the employee to think about who to tell. Often people start with their immediate supervisor, since that person will be on the front line of helping to manage the workload and the team. It is important to remember that often supervisors weren't trained to be supervisors, so this kind of information may have never crossed their path, so it will be a learning experience for everyone involved. HR is another obvious choice for disclosure. They can provide an incredible amount of information and support. In a recent survey we did at Cancer and Careers, which I'll talk more about in a minute, 53% of the patients and survivors we surveyed found their HR department at work to be very helpful in addressing concerns about working cancer. But over a third of those surveyed were hesitant to reach out to HR. So there's a complicated conversation happening there, which might mean that someone's missing out on information and access that they really need. In terms of coworkers, it's going to really go back to that company culture and how that employee wants to control their narrative and how much they want to have known. In general, when it comes to thinking about what they're going to tell, keeping it simple is helpful. For some people, sharing their diagnosis and treatment and surgery schedule is totally natural. For others, they may choose to share information farther down the timeline when the treatment side effects begin to have an impact, and they may opt to only share info about those side effects rather than the specifics of a diagnosis. For any of these conversations, focusing on an action plan for getting the work done helps to show the workplace how invested the person is in their job. And of course, there's a caveat, which is that everyone involved in this equation is going to need to keep it somewhat fluid, because what someone knows on day one might be different than what they know at the end of year one in terms of the toll treatment took. As I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of the ADA is reasonable accommodations, which can seem daunting to identify and manage, but really they're just practical solutions that might make work easier. And we're going to talk more about workplace and schedule modifications that may be considered accommodations in a little while. While it is important to note that employers are required to provide them unless they can show it presents an undue hardship, it is also important to note that these conversations are supposed to be interactive and ongoing so that it works for both the employee and the employer. Patients are also facing during this period of time thinking about managing side effects, including focus, which is a big issue in the workplace. And so we encourage them to talk to their doctor and healthcare team about what their job entails to make sure that they're thinking through how to approach all of that. And certainly the Cancer and Careers website has a lot of practical advice on these topics. And then the final key point here that is often not focused on is that employees should know that they can use the Family and Medical Leave Act to take unpaid time off either intermittently, say every third Friday for chemo, or in larger chunks to accommodate their treatment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Next slide, please. As I mentioned moments ago, Cancer and Careers has been doing some research because we have a commitment to increasing the information and knowledge base around people who are going through this experience. And so we partner with Harris Poll, and we just released our 2015 survey results. And the 2 points I want to focus you in on this slide are really how important work is to people when it comes to thinking about their cancer experience. So 73% of employed survivors who were surveyed reported that working during treatment helped them cope. And 69% of surveyed patients and survivors said that cancer recovery is aided by the routine nature of work. For me, that's always such a driving factor in these conversations, is the possibility that work is providing a positive outcome for them as they go through this is very profound. Change slide, please. So one of the fears we often hear from survivors and employers alike is that reasonable accommodations will be expensive or complicated to provide. And this slide shares data collected by the Job Accommodation Network, which is a program of the Department of Labor. And it's really useful because it gives us an actual sense of what this looks like. So it turns out that 58% of reasonable accommodations cost the employer nothing, and 36% have a one-time cost that's typically around $500. So these are more about thinking creatively than they are thinking expensively. And 84% of the employers who called the Job Accommodation Network for information or help were doing so because they wanted to retain or promote a current employee. So there's a drive here to support in the workplace and to use the tools that are available. And so one of the things that hopefully today will help with is giving you access to more information that helps you do that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to hear from a couple of survivors who worked during treatment. And this quote provides some advice from a breast cancer survivor to managers on taking the lead from the employee when it comes to disclosing a diagnosis at work. She said, "So I would say just be patient and just take whatever cues from them, but when they're ready to be open. And maybe some people may not choose to share it, and don't be offended by it. That's a personal thing for a lot of people. Just because some people choose to do one thing, everyone's not the same. So I think you just have to be supportive and let them know that you are. Whatever you need to do that and get that message across." Change slide, please. For this employee, finding a way to work as much as possible was important. And for his team and his manager, helping him do that was worth it. Here he explains some of what that was like. The chemo I had was, it would be 1 week, 5 days of infusions, and then 2 weeks of essentially recovery. The infusions were actually pretty extensive, of 5 to 6 hours. I could bring my laptop to those, and I would do a little bit of work and did what I could. But I certainly scaled back, obviously, on the amount of work I was doing. The chemo regimen that I was on, it was certainly cumulative in terms of the side effects. I actually recovered pretty well, and after those 5 days, I was back in the office on Monday. I'd kind of recovered over the weekend and then come back to the office and work the full 2 weeks after that without much impact. Then actually, as the treatment progressed and the side effects became a little bit more, I was a little bit more fatigued. The chemo brain, I think, was part of the side effects there, and I think it was starting to get a little bit more as the treatments go on. But the team that I was on were very accommodating. They picked up some of my work gladly, and like I said, my manager was very accommodating. Next slide, please. For some people, working through treatment is either not their preference or not realistic, at least not for all of it. So it's also important to understand that the Family and Medical Leave Act may apply here. As I mentioned earlier, the FMLA may be used by eligible employees intermittently, which can be a great option for someone trying to work throughout their treatment. However, most people are familiar with it because it is the federal law that makes a 12-week job-protected and health insurance-protected leave from work possible. It is important to note that the FMLA doesn't apply to everyone. You have to work for a large enough employer, that is one with 50 or more employees or any size government, and work enough hours in a 12-month period to access it. There is obviously a lot more nuance to it, and so as with every law, it is critical for both employers and employees to understand what the requirements and entitlements are. Medical certification is the process where an employee provides some info from a member of their healthcare team to their employer to support their request for leave time or access to a reasonable accommodation. It is again important for everyone involved to understand what info the employer is entitled to. For more on this topic, you can visit the Cancer and Careers website. For people taking time off, another key piece of the puzzle is whether they have access to either private or state or federal disability insurance, which is designed to be some income replacement for someone who can't work. One of the key misconceptions is that being out on disability insurance is job protected. And unless an employer has a specific policy in place that states otherwise for some period of time, it actually is not. It's really designed to help provide the income that's being lost by being out on leave. Another thing that comes up for people when they are out on leave, be it short stints or long term, is how much contact can they have with their workplace, or what should they be doing to stay relevant. It is important that employees out on leave from a job they're going back to know what the employer rules are for being in contact with their workplace, and vice versa. It is important for the employers to know that an employee out on leave is meant to be on leave. Next slide, please. So a little bit of data around the Family and Medical Leave Act. Over 50 million people have taken FMLA leave. About 50% of workers taking leave for a serious illness, either their own or a family member, take it for 10 days or less. And 78% of those who need FMLA leave but don't take the leave because they can't afford it. Change slide, please. So now in our ARC, our employee who has gone through a cancer experience is returning to work. And so the key issues they're going to be facing are thinking through getting back into the routine, what if any ongoing treatment or side effects they're experiencing, setting realistic expectations so that they can have a successful return to work process. And they'll also be facing an issue around managing their cancer identity. How are they going to handle questions about their cancer? How can they help their company see them as the vibrant contributor they are, not as a person diminished because of a cancer experience? And these become very big concerns for survivors, both the ones who work through treatment and the ones who go back to work afterwards, which is that they won't move forward as quickly as they would have otherwise, or they won't be seen to be as strong a member of the team as someone who didn't go through what they went through. And for people who look for work after time off for cancer, they're going to be facing questions like whether it's necessary to address a cancer history in an interview, and the practical side of dealing with a gap in work history on a resume or in an interview, and how to go about a job search if they're mid or post-treatment. It's also important for patients to understand how the law relates to their return to work. So if they were out on FMLA leave, they can expect to be returned to the same or equivalent position, meaning essentially that their title or level in the company, salary, and benefits are all reinstated. If they took time off as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, they must be reinstated to their exact same job. So there's again nuance for both sides of the equation to be aware of. The ADA also protects someone from discrimination through all phases of the employment process, which includes job interviews. Next slide, please. So 2 years ago, Cancer and Careers' Harris poll was focused on people who'd been diagnosed with cancer and were unemployed but looking for work. And I'll just point you to the bullet that says 50% of surveyed cancer survivors fear disclosing would negatively affect their ability to get hired. So there is a great deal of concern in the cancer community about how they move forward after this and what people think of them if they happen to find this out, either because they shared it on purpose or because it was discovered in an online posting somewhere. Next slide, please. So as we move into a few slides that are really focused on some simple things you can do in the workplace to support someone balancing their job and a diagnosis, our final quote addresses the need for managers to have information on this issue as well and a place to turn for support. And honestly, I couldn't say it better than myself. This is from a lymphoma survivor. I think if there was something for a manager, if you have an employee that becomes severely ill, what do you do? How do you handle it? There's lots of ideas and books and materials available to people, and we don't provide any of that. Managers go through their leadership trainings, they go through their employee engagements, they go through how to deal with harassment and ethics issues, but they don't have any training on how you deal with people that are dealing with life-changing events. So I think if maybe my manager had received some of that information, maybe she would have taken a different path than the way she dealt with me. Change slide, please. The first question that typically comes up as a manager is, what do I need to know to be prepared? And you'll need to know what might seem pretty basic, really, information on company policy. Specifically, these are the areas that are likely to come up, some of which we sort of touched on already in terms of the employee side of the equation. But what is the medical leave policy? Is there one? Does the company provide short and or long-term disability benefits? And how does a person go about accessing them, and when should they do that? Certainly health insurance becomes even more critical in this conversation, and for many people they may not have had to use their health insurance in this way before, and so there's a lot of unknown there. Are there any flexible work policies already in place in the company that could be accessed by this person? How does paid time off work? Are there leave banks, which is a benefit that is beginning to crop up in some companies where people can donate unused PTO days into a bank that can be drawn on by someone who's going through something like a cancer experience. And typically, you know, what makes you eligible to access the leave bank is pretty well spelled out, but it can be a great benefit both for the people who would otherwise be losing, quote unquote, those days, and for people who in a year might need access to more than they typically have. And for those of you in HR, you've most likely dealt with these issues before, so your experience and institutional knowledge can be a huge help both in supporting the employee going through it, but also whoever the frontline manager might be. That institutional knowledge is invaluable in these situations. And certainly for managers, this is a great time to turn to HR to find out how things like this have been handled in the past and what options are already available and on the table for your employee. Another area that can often be helpful for someone, going back to that insurance piece, is that it's really likely that HR has more leverage in dealing with your insurance carriers than an average individual employee. So if you can help with things like lingo or making an extra call to expedite or clarify things when issues come up, that can go an enormous way in keeping the path moving forward smoothly for your employee who's trying to manage all of this. Change slide, please. Most people simply don't know what to say when faced with an employee disclosing a cancer diagnosis. Speechless is usually the reaction. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on what to say and what not to say, as in the moment finding the best words can often be challenging, especially if you've never faced something like this before. First, assess how close you are to this person. It's also important to take your cues from them. Tune in and focus on their reactions when you are talking. Here are just a few examples to get you started and thinking. I'm sorry this is happening to you. It's very simple and straightforward. I don't know what to say or how to say it, but I do want you to know I'm here for you. This acknowledges your awkwardness and lets your staff member know if she feels like talking, you're a willing audience. This may be enough of an exchange for now, especially if the diagnosis is new. Don't worry about work. Of course, only say this if it happens to be true, so best coming from someone who's sitting in that perspective. But if there's a moment where that's the case, that can be very freeing. I'm thinking of you. Just a very simple focus on the fact that you're there and you care. How are you feeling today? Asking that way instead of something more pointed allows the colleague to open up and tell you details, or simply give a brief answer and move on. May I email you? Email, although some days I'm not so sure about this, is not as intrusive as a voicemail or telephone call. It doesn't beg an immediate response as a text seems to do, and it allows the person to answer you when the workload or mood permit. And then very importantly, something like, wasn't that a productive or interesting or boring or whatever meeting? Remembering to talk about quote unquote normal work activities is important. That way cancer talk doesn't dominate every conversation, since work can be a break from thinking about the cancer. Even more than that, for many of us, work is tied to our sense of identity, as we talked about. And so when someone is going through a cancer experience, they're already facing a mortality crisis, and if work is at risk, their identity can be threatened as well. Next slide, please. And here are a few things not to say. Some may seem totally obvious in this moment, but I can't tell you the stories we've heard. So to start, I know how you feel. Even if you were diagnosed with the exact same kind of cancer, you can't know how that person feels. There are just too many variables. My brother had this kind of cancer, and he was in the hospital for months. A cancer diagnosis opens you up to all of the stories, and it can be burdensome and upsetting to hear horror stories. You may think you're showing that you relate to the person, but probably all they're hearing is the part about being in the hospital for months. I know this will turn out okay. That sounds so upbeat, but saying it will turn out fine dismisses the anxiety about the outcome. Instead of the blanket reassurance, try, whatever happens, I'm here for you, but only if you really will be. The same thing happened to my neighbor, and it worked out fine. Often people will point out someone else who went through it, as in, my neighbor lost her hair and hated it when it first returned, but now it's very cute. Nice story, but it takes the focus off the colleague's angst. What she really may want is for you to join her in that awful moment of time and just commiserate. You need to focus on her challenge. Or, did you drink? Do you smoke? Did you tan? Even if they didn't do anything to cause it, there's still a feeling of guilt, a feeling they could have prevented it. So while it's natural to wonder what caused someone to have cancer, best to leave those thoughts inside. And then again, don't let cancer dominate every conversation. Realize that your coworker may not want to talk about the experience, and once treatment is finished, that may be even less and less. So allow him to start discussions about cancer. Many people go back to work hoping for this kind of support and camaraderie and a return to normal. Next slide, please. This probably looks quite familiar from a slide we looked at a couple of moments ago, but this is also some of the information that you can gather for your employee. And since you've just done all your research on what to know, it should all be handy. Much of it is typically found in a company or employee handbook or on an intranet service, but it's helpful to provide another copy or make sure your employee still has access to the intranet so that it's really easy and straightforward. Next slide, please. One of the first things you want to understand from the staff member with cancer is how public or private they want to be about it. Not everyone is going to be comfortable having this kind of news known widely. It's also important to lay some ground rules for communications beforehand with your employee. Some best practices that we suggest are depending upon what arrangements you've made, of course, but it might be helpful to identify a point person, someone they trust, who's willing to be a centralized source of information about them, their health, their schedule. A point person saves your employee from having to constantly update everyone on how they're feeling, and that point person can also be your employee's go-to person to find out what's happening at the office. Creating a written plan helps to ensure that everyone has the same expectations, and it also has the added benefit of making sure when it's time to do a performance appraisal, it's as trouble-free as possible because you've been working off the same thing. And it's really important to think through how to keep that employee with cancer included and vital and how to show coworkers that the job is getting done. So in terms of keeping in touch, institute daily or weekly email wrap-ups or phone calls. Create an online document sharing program that everyone can keep up to date on project progress, but that is easily accessible from anywhere. Make sure the employee stays visible by participating in face-to-face meetings, attending social activities, and serving on committees on days that they're in the office. Next slide, please. There are many ways for people to work through treatment, and you and your employee may mix and match strategies to adapt as treatment progresses. So I'm just going to call out a couple here to get you thinking. Sometimes cancer treatment side effects can be worked around, so shifting hours or important meetings to times of day when the person is feeling best. You can troubleshoot by posting an in and out of office schedule and making sure that the staff knows who the designated point person is. For some people, they're more alert from 8 to 4 instead of 9 to 6. And so maybe it's just about tweaking those times of day that they're working to better meet when the fatigue is at its worst. In certain circumstances, telecommuting can be a good solution for those in treatment and recovery. If it is an option in your company, try these steps to keep the work team going strong. Jointly come up with a written communication plan that gives the days and times the employee plans to be at home or in the office. Decide together how and when you'll be in touch with one another and how and when others who need to communicate with the employee can do so. If possible, keep up with regularly scheduled meetings and training, either live or by conference call. Find a telecommuting partner, a coworker who can help the person working from home keep connected to the informal communication channels. Set up things like instant messenger so that there's a fast, easy way to be in touch with that employee during the day when you would normally pop over to their desk, but instead you can jump on instant messenger and send a note. And of course, anything you can do to help your employees with cancer work from home will be greatly appreciated. This might mean coming up with equipment that you can loan to them while they're working at home. You and the employee can also consult with IT to determine what's needed and how to ensure that the employee has remote access to the office systems and voicemail that will be necessary on the days they're at home. Some jobs have allocated breaks and lunch times. For someone going through treatment, providing additional sanctioned breaks or an extended lunch might be key to successfully working through treatment. Not all jobs are suitable for strategies like telecommuting or flexible work. This may call for some creative thinking on the part of the whole staff. Tasks might be interchanged or coworkers cross-trained to stand in when schedules must be adjusted. Again, these are just ideas to get you started. Change slide, please. One of the major workplace obstacles that we get asked about all the time is how to stay focused and concentrate. So we suggest you recommend to your employees that they go back to basics, forget multitasking, write down a list of priorities, then turn off their email and phone and focus on one thing at a time. As distractions decrease, concentration increases. You may even want to give them permission to set time aside on the calendar for meetings with themselves, as people are typically worried that if they get an email from their boss and they don't respond immediately, it will be a problem. Laying this out as an option will give your employee peace of mind. Other tips, they should write everything down so if they forget, they'll always have a record. They should keep a single notebook with all their to-dos so they're in one place and they take it everywhere. If they give presentations or provide project updates or do sales calls, rehearsing those things and writing up a script can be incredibly helpful. Again, there's not a perfect solution to the focus question. It's about coming up with good strategies that give sort of a safety net so that if someone does lose their train of thought, there's a way to get it back. Next slide, please. In terms of side effects, each person is going to be different depending upon their diagnosis, their treatment, their reaction to the treatment, their circumstances overall. But to briefly talk about them in a general way, we hear most often from patients about having trouble focusing or chemo brain or cognitive dysfunction or the mental fog, and the tips on the previous slide we hope will help with that. The other thing we hear about a great deal is fatigue. So if it's possible to offer a quiet place to lie down or to take a break, that can be a huge help. The effect of the physical changes can't be underestimated when someone's working through treatment. Women tell us that losing their hair can be the most devastating because it's such an outward-facing manifestation of the disease. It announces to the world that they have cancer. This can also happen with skin changes and weight fluctuations. Of course, you can't necessarily help with all the side effects. These are just things to be aware of and sensitive to. You may also want to encourage your employee to talk about the work-related side effects with their healthcare team, as they may have some solutions that the two of you wouldn't have come up with on your own. Change slide, please. One way you might be able to help is by modifying their workspace. Talk about how to make their workspace more comfortable and productive so that you can tweak it as needed. Simple things like setting it up so they don't have to expend any unnecessary energy. If a special chair is going to be more comfortable, they should bring one in, or a backrest or pillow. Perhaps providing a printer at their desk would make a difference. They don't have to waste energy walking every time they need a document. For some people, a side effect of treatment is numbness or tingling in their hands, so maybe getting SpeakType software for them would help if they spend their day typing. One final note on this, many people balancing work and cancer struggle with worries about being seen as diminished, as we've talked about, and that it will hold them back or that it will be the only thing the people around them see or want to talk about. So when thinking about an employee's comfort, it is also helpful to consider making sure they continue to feel like a valued member of the team with something to offer. Next slide, please. So this was obviously just an overview of some things to think about. What is your employee thinking about when they go through this issue, and what are some immediate things that you can be thinking about if you have an employee going through it? But the big question that was posed by one of the survivor voices that we heard from is, wouldn't it have been great if there was a place my manager could go for support? And now there is. There is a program that is the sponsor of today's webinar, Workplace Transitions for People Touched by Cancer. And it is a free web-based toolkit for employers that they can access that walks through all of these issues for their employees and helps make it possible to think through what you could do in your workplace to make this path smoother. It was piloted in 2014 by 6 major companies, and it was released publicly in 2015. And as you'll see on this slide, I included a little bit of data from the managers who accessed the toolkit during the pilot, and you'll see that very much they found the resource helpful, especially in providing some emotional support, and that it was easy to access and use. So the goal of it was to be all of those things and more. So the website is below. It's at workplacetransitions.org. And if you'll change the slide one more time for me, you'll also see what the landing page of the toolkit looks like. So there's information for your managers if they're dealing with it. There's some information you can send to an employee that gives them links to stuff that would be useful for them. There was a white paper written on the topic related to the project that you can access from the website. So it's really your one-stop shop. Change slide, please.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. We now have time for a few questions and answers from all the participants in the room. So I'd like to invite them all to jot down their questions in the chat box, and I'll relay the message to Rebecca.
And also for those on the telephone, you can send them via email to webinars@adaconferences.org, and we'll provide those to Rebecca as well.
Thank you, Claudia. First question that has come in, Rebecca, is what should staff do when a manager, him or herself, gets cancer in a company that's too small to have a centralized human resources staff?
It's a great question. I don't know that there is a short and sweet answer to it. I think everyone could be in the role of either the employee with cancer who needs to disclose or the manager managing someone. So that manager is also going to need to think about who they talk to if they want to share at work. And I would say that the place to start would be someone in the workplace has some management of the HR type things that come up. And so thinking about who that person is and what kind of relationship that manager has with that person would be an important thing to think about. For some people who work in a very small environment, they're going to go straight to the CEO or the president because really that's how small the place is, and they're going to figure it out together. We've certainly anecdotally at Cancer and Careers seen a lot of policies developed out of an experience that happens in real time, and that certainly can be true in small companies. And then there's the part where the manager then needs to think about what they want to share with their staff. And that's obviously also a very complex and personal set of decision making that that person will need to do.
Excellent, thank you. I think you talked about disclosure quite a bit. And are there ways to, quote, erase aspects of one's social media footprint, particularly if they disclose their cancer diagnosis on their social media pages?
That's a great question, and we actually spend a lot of time focused on that with patients and survivors and healthcare professionals as well as employers because it's become such a pervasive part of all of our lives, and it feels like something we're doing kind of privately. You know, you're on your phone posting something and you're not talking to anyone, but it's the loudest thing that you might do in a day. So what we typically recommend is certainly part of it is education early so that you're being mindful and you're running through what you're posting through some filters like would I want this to be on the front page of my local newspaper, would I want my boss to know this, so that you're asking yourself those questions before you post. But in the case of many people wherein we're looking back at something, it's hard to get something erased completely from the web, but there are some things that people can do to elevate their profile in other ways. So making sure that you're using LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter in ways that are professional because those are the heaviest hits online generally. So you want to get those rankings highest on a search page, and hopefully that'll push down some of the other stuff that maybe you've done, like your personal blog if you were blogging. Setting up a professional website can be a helpful thing to do because that'll typically rise higher in a search ranking. There are companies that exist, we don't endorse any of them specifically, who can work with you to erase some stuff from your online footprint if you feel really strongly about it. And the Cancer and Careers website has an article that has 6 or 7 additional tips on things you can do yourself before you get to that point.
Excellent, great points, Rebecca. Another question that just came in is, how do you weigh the financial impact of the employees returning to work for mental health reasons versus the impact to the impact on their short-term disability or long-term disability benefits? For example, we have an employee who thinks they could work part-time, but they are currently at the max benefit for short-term disability.
That's an interesting question, and I don't know if I can answer it with only that amount of information, because certainly as we get into the specifics of a single company's policies, it's hard to know, and also what other kind of transitional benefits and opportunities that person might have access to. I don't really have a great answer to that. I think it's always helpful to have a realistic conversation with the employee in question and make sure that they understand what the cost benefit of something would be in terms of, so if we do figure out a part-time to return to work, this will stop. Can you live if that happens? Because sometimes I think that when a person is going through this and they're being driven by sort of an emotional or psychosocial or intellectual need, they haven't necessarily done the math. And so if you can help them think it through completely, if you're open to that, if the company is open to that conversation, that can be a really useful way for the person to assess whether it's a realistic moment to start coming back to work. I hope that helped a little bit.
Definitely. We have a few more questions that are coming in. What should the manager tell a well-meaning colleague who wants to help but are asking for more information about the employee's situation than the other person wants to divulge?
That's a great question. Some of it's going to come down to sort of the culture of the place to begin with, how the manager can rely on what is typically shared in general. But then I think it's going to be something to the effect of, you know what Jane is comfortable having you know, and we are working very hard to support her and make sure that everyone's workload is appropriate and everyone's work can get done.
Simple as that.
I mean, it's not actually simple to do, and I 100% recognize that, but people aren't entitled to know more than that, and so finding a way to say that, and depending upon the environment, another thing I might say might be something to the effect of, and if it were you, I would follow your wishes in the same way.
Exactly. Also, do accommodations differ in typical ways depending on the type of cancer in your experience?
So I would actually say, I was going to say no, but it really depends on the side effects, because most often the day you get diagnosed and the next day aren't different for someone. It's once they start going through treatment and they experience side effects that they start to have a challenge in general and specifically at work. Because it's the side effects that are causing those problems. And so certainly there are certain treatment protocols that have typical side effects that come along with them, and that's why we also encourage an employee to talk to their healthcare team so they're getting all the information they can from their healthcare team about what they might expect to have happen, so that when they're trying to figure out what to do at work, they're coming at it with as much information as possible. But it's also going to be very specific to what the person does. So even if there are typical side effects for a certain treatment protocol, you also have to have in the equation, is this person a cashier at the checkout in a grocery store, or is this person a museum greeter, or is this person a security guard, or is this person a president of a company sitting behind a desk all day, or is this person a president of a company who's actually never in the office because they're always in an airplane? So like all of those nuances are why talking about a typical set of side effects and accommodations don't make sense, because we'd also have to know what that person's job is.
Right. Well, thank you. I think you talked about this quite a bit, but what are some common ways to accommodate an employee with cancer who wants to continue working through treatment if telecommuting is not an option?
So I think what's important is to leave everyone thinking about is not that telecommuting is the only solution. It can be a solution, but if that's not going to work for whatever reason for the workplace and the person, what are other things that might? And so it is supposed to be an interactive and an ongoing process, and the employer shouldn't reject an idea outright without another idea, and vice versa, the employee shouldn't reject their manager's idea outright without sort of talking it through. So I think the example that I used earlier is actually pretty relevant to the question of if telecommuting isn't an option. So perhaps it's not about telecommuting because the person needs to physically go to the office, but it could be that they do 4 10-hour days and don't work on Fridays, but they're still working the same number of hours that they would have if they worked Monday through Friday. Or maybe they work 12 to 8 every day, Monday through Friday, so they can have the morning to go to treatment and then have a little time to recover before they come to work, and also the added benefit of missing the commute. So a commute that would normally take an hour is now down to half an hour because it's not actually at the peak of rush hour. So it's really about thinking about all the things that go into what someone's job is and what the needs are of the boss and the company, and figuring out if there's a solution in there. But in my museum greeter example, working 12 to 8 won't work if the museum hours are 9 to 5. So it's going to have to be reasonable to the job in question.
Understand. A final question that's come in is, what are good ways for a manager to accommodate an employee with cancer who has been on leave and is returning to work after surgery versus radiation and versus chemotherapy? Or is there a difference between those?
I think there can be, and it kind of, I feel, I don't want to put everyone to sleep with the repetitiveness. It really will depend on what the job is. So if someone recovering from surgery who works as a, say, a receptionist. Maybe they can come back because sitting at a desk and greeting people and answering the phone and scheduling isn't a problem, but they're not allowed to lift things for a period of time after their surgery by doctor's orders. And they typically are also responsible for restocking the office supplies. So perhaps in that case, the accommodation is that someone else takes over that restocking duty until they're allowed to lift things again. So that could look a little bit different than someone who is going through chemo, and as it is cumulative, the way we heard from the quote earlier, it started to increase the fatigue, and so maybe then they need to think about what kind of accommodations might make sense related to someone who's experiencing a depth of fatigue that's new and different. So again, it's going to be more about what that person's reaction to it is and what their job actually requires of them.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think this is the last question. I'll give folks a couple seconds to jot down their questions to us in the chat box. But on the next two slides, we also have a group of resources for all of you. On this slide, on slide 40, we have employment rights and options resources, disability insurance rights and options resources, and finally legal assistance. On slide 41, we have additional resources such as the ADA National Network, RNJAN, the NET, and the links to these organizations. So it doesn't look like any more questions have come in, so I'll just let you guys know that the next USBLN webinar titled Corporate Year-End Envying Strategies that Bolster Disability Employment is scheduled for October 21st, and the link to register is on this slide. And finally, here's a link to our evaluation, and we'll send you this link to the evaluation later today in an email. And on this final note, I'd like to thank you, Rebecca, for your presentation today. It was very informative, and to all the participants who joined the session. And a special thank you to Great Lakes and the sponsors of this webinar, Workplace Transitions. So thank you, and we hope you enjoyed today's session.
This concludes today's session. To exit the webinar platform, you can click on the X in the upper right-hand corner. If you're on the telephone, you can disconnect at this time. Thank you and have a good afternoon.